We're planning to build a timber frame wood-fired sauna, the inside of which will be lined with white cedar tongue and groove paneling. Here I'm going to show you how I make that paneling. The cedar I have is mostly 2x dimension and rough cut. So the first step is to actually joint one face, so they have a smooth perpendicular face that I can run on the bandsaw table when resawing. Alright, setting up to resaw here, I will first make sure the table is square to the blade. It is. Then we'll set the resaw depth I want. The back of the fence is already clamped. I'm just sliding the front to get the spacing I want. I want to go about 7/8 of an inch there to the center of the blade in this case for what I'm doing. And then clamp the front of the fence. Nice and firm. Confirm that I got enough headroom for what I'm trying to resaw, and we're ready to go. So I use a simple shop-made resaw table, just made out of 3/4 inch plywood that has a little nose of wood tacked onto the plywood parallel to the blade. That allows you to steer the wood kind of through the blade as you feed the piece you're cutting, and correct for any blade drift if there is any. Now there isn't much here because I've got a nice 1 inch wide carbide tipped resaw blade on the saw that chews pretty quickly through this 6-inch white cedar. And I'm just kind of eyeballing down the center of the board as I feed this through. Now behind the bandsaw table you'll actually see my jointer in the background, and it happens that my jointer fence, the top of the jointer fence, sits about 1/4 of an inch below the bandsaw table, which is convenient because it allows me to use the space, and it also kind of serves as an informal outfeed table for the bandsaw. So now that the boards are resawn and approaching 1x rough cut material, I now feed them through the planer. First turn on the dust collection system. I'm lucky enough to have my blast gates have switches on them so that the dust collection system gets turned on automatically when I open the blast gate on the machine in question. Now normally before planing I joint one face, but these are actually going to end up being 11/16 thick paneling, which is pretty flexible and doesn't really need to be perfectly flat, or it has a little twist in it. You can work that out when you install it. So I'm just feeding the boards through the planer here. You'll notice you'll hear a little thump every once in a while. The planer's got a feed roller that's skipping on it. Now Grizzly has sent me some parts that they say will fix that, so maybe I'll post a video of getting that sorted out later. My dust collector sits in the back in the shop, and there's a clear hose on it that allows me to see that dust is, smoothly making its way into the collection bin, and when that hose starts to plug up, I know it's time to empty the dust collector. Now when planing a series of boards like this, you'll notice I sort of try to keep the boards feeding fairly continuously through the planer. That avoids any what they call snipe changes in thickness at the end of the board as the board exits the feed rollers. Not a big deal, but if you can keep the boards running continuously, it avoids that. You notice that I realized partway through that I forgot to put on my hearing protection, so I stuck that on. The truth is, this carbide planer is fairly quiet compared to my old planer. You'll also notice that I'm just really using my table saw and outfeed table in the background as work surface. I just put the material on there and flip it back and forth as I continue to do my planing. So at this point I've got one edge jointed and both faces planed smooth, and my material down to the desired 11/16 thickness, so I just need to cut it to width, raise the blade on the table saw up to just beyond the thickness of the material, set the rip fence to the right width and rip away. I'm lucky enough that I have a saw stop table saw, so I know that if I touch a finger to the blade will stop without doing significant damage to my fingers, and yes, I can honestly say I've tested the mechanism and it works. So next to the table saw and the wood shop, I have a pool table. That spends most of its life as a shop work table, work surface. And right now that's where I'm storing the boards as they get cut to finished dimension. The little strips of wood that got cut off the edges of the board when I ripped them, well, those are just fire starters, and I move over to the chop saw station. I like this little dust hood I found. Dust collection on a chop saw is notoriously difficult, and I find this actually fairly effective. So here I'm just chopping those little scraps to length, and I'm going to use those for firewood. White cedar is a very effective fire starter. So now that my cedar boards are all dimensioned, the next step is to cut the tongue and groove on the edges. And here's my little test pieces I made up. That I do on my router table. I say router table, but really I've installed a router lift from Jessam in the outfeed table of my SawStop table saw, and I find it super handy. Using the drill as my cheat to raise and lower the bit quickly. And so here I'm just going to install one of the bits. They come as a matched pair sets. These are I think a Yoniko bit set I found on Amazon. Maybe I'll stick a link to a few of these items in the comments section in the video. Pretty straightforward. It's a 1/2 inch shank. Stick it in the collet, tighten the collet down, and then wind the rudder lift back down to the right level. Install the little collar around the bit there to make it flush with the table. And then any fine-tuning adjustments I make with a little hand crank that came with the router lift. And this is where having done a test piece up ahead of time comes in handy, because the test piece makes it very easy to set the height of the bit correctly. And for something like a tongue and groove panel, it's fairly critical to get those heights set just right. With the router bit height set, next I want to set up my router table fence. And while I have seen fancier router table fence arrangements with T-slots in the table, my approach, I just use a simple, again, plywood made, shop made auxiliary fence that drops on top of my table saw fence. I do screw it down in place. You'll notice it's got a couple of built-up layers of plywood, and there's a little recess where the bit goes so that I can recess the bit into the fence. And I will use a straight edge to line up the feed direction of the fence so that it's right flush with the guide bearing that is on this router bit. For dust collection, I have just a portable 2-inch hose that I connect to a small plenum box that I built underneath the router table. It's not perfect, but it does provide some suction down through the opening in the router table. I have a switch for the router mounted on the table saw outfeed table there right next to the router, which I find convenient. And to feed the workpiece through the bit, I just use the push paddles from my jointer. Probably not perfect. I maybe should be using a featherboard hold down and something to hold the workpiece in tight against the table. But for one-offs, I find this pretty effective. Now when I do that whole pile of wood that you saw on the pool table, maybe I will hook up some featherboards. So the pace is maybe a little slow here, but at this point I've finished cutting the groove on one side of the board, and I need to switch over to the other bit in the paired set of router bits. So I'm just kind of reversing the process you saw me use to put the bit in the first place. I've slid the fence out of the way, removed the little collar, used my drill to spin the rudder lift up so I can get the collet wrenches on there, loosen the collet, swap out and put the other bit in there. I have everything stored in drawers that are in my table saw outfeed table right there next to the router, so it's a pretty convenient setup. So I'll just tighten up the collet nut here and repeat the same process I used in installing the previous bit. You know, use the drill to quickly spin the rudder lift down to about the right height. Install the throat plate, and there's a little tool that came with the rudder lift for doing that. And then with it at about the right height, I'll use the hand crank handle, and again checking against my sample board to get the height just right for cutting the tongue so that we have a nice matched pair. And then again just slide the fence back into place, and I'm using my straight edge like I did before to line up the feed direction on the fence with that guide bearing that's installed on the rudder bit. Start my dust collection system and turn on the rudder. And again, I'm using the push paddles from my jointer. I find they are pretty effective at holding the workpiece down, both holding it down to the table and holding it against the bit. Now with this setup, it's not a problem if the workpiece slides away from the fence, because you can't cut too deep because the bit's, you know, inset into the fence. You do, however, have to make sure that you hold your workpiece firmly down to the table. Otherwise your groove won't be at the right height. And for that reason, I probably should be using some featherboard hold downs attached to my fence. That's really the full process for cutting tongue and groove paneling. Now I just have to do about 1,300 more feet of it. Thanks for watching.